Galway Public Libraries welcome you to this year's Galway's Great Read, titled Westward Ho, a Ramble Through Galway, 1840 to 1950. The Great Read programme promotes our literary heritage, unique culture and history, and fosters an appreciation for its diversity and richness. This year, our programme is centred around the work of three travel writers, husband and wife team, Anna Maria Hall and Samuel, who visited County Galway several times prior to the Great Famine. Sir William Wilde, an extraordinarily interesting and intellectual man who wrote in the 1860s. And Richard Hayward, an actor, singer and musician turned travel writer, who explored the highways and byways of the county between the 1930s and the 1940s. We hope you enjoy this series of talks for Galway's Great Read 2021, Westward Ho, a Ramble Through Galway, 1840-1950.
Thank you, Jo. We are delighted to welcome our guest today, Dr. Amélie Dochy Jacquard, Associate Professor in the Department of English at the University of Toulouse in France. Unfortunately, our meeting with Amelia is virtual today, but we are nonetheless delighted to welcome her to Galway. Amelia has taught at the University of Ireland in Maynooth for a period of time, so is no stranger to our shores. Her research interests include visual representation of the Irish in the second half of the 19th century. Her talk focuses on the first of our travel writers, the Halls, who compiled a 3-volume mixed travelogue and social commentary of Ireland titled Ireland, Its Scenery, Character, etc. Galway featured in the 3rd volume, which was published in 1843. We are very much looking forward to Amelia's talk, titled Imperial Gaze and Tourism in Galway, Anna Marie and Samuel Carter Hall's Exotic Explorations in the 1840s. We hope you enjoy.
My presentation today is called Imperial Gaze and Tourism in Galway, Anna Maria and Samuel Carter Hall's Exotic Exploration in the 1840s. Now, tourism is a quest for discovery, change, and pleasant time in a different location. This appetite for exotic adventures is reflected in the numerous guidebooks published in the 19th century in the context of the expanding British Empire, which opened new possibilities of traveling. Just like us, Victorians often resorted to such volumes in order to make the best of their journeys abroad, and it is in this perspective that Anna Maria Fielding and Samuel Carter Hall, both born in Ireland at the dawn of the century, wrote their own 3 volumes on their country of origin, entitled Ireland, Its Scenery, Character, etc. You should be able to see it here. And they were published in London between 1841 and 1843. Anna Maria had previously risen to fame in 1829 with Sketches of Irish Character, a collection of stories inspired by her childhood in Wexford. She was encouraged to write by Samuel Carter, to whom she had got married in 1824, and who was already a journalist in London by then. Later on, he would become the editor of the art journal, and together they kept frequent company with artists in London, including Daniel Maclise, who drew a portrait of Anna Maria when she was 33, that you can see here. Samuel Carter was also born in Ireland, in Waterford, but his family had to move to England after the bankruptcy of his father. So the author's common love for their native country must have motivated their literary adventure. Their long account, each volume is about 500 pages, resulted, I quote, from several tours made by the writers together since the year 1825, the latest of which having taken place during the autumn of the year 1840. The very word tour alludes to the grand tour tradition, so dear to the British who traveled to continental Europe to complete their education. But the Napoleonic Wars, having closed the routes of Europe, the Celtic fringe surrounding England was reassessed as a viable destination. From the mid-19th century onwards, lower middle classes started to go on holidays too, hence the development of tourism as an industry. Thomas Cook's first organized trip took place in 1841, which was the year when the Hall's first volume on Ireland was printed, and it was soon followed by the second opus a year later, while the last volume, devoting 10 pages to the area around Galway, came out of the press in 1843. Ireland was then at the forefront of British politics. 1843 was actually designated as the repeal year by Daniel O'Connell, who was struggling in the British Parliament to get a constitutional recognition of Ireland's specific national identity through Home Rule, so that one may wonder how these books reflect the political questioning of the union between Ireland and England. The opinion of the Halls was quite clear. Anna Maria wore orange and green ribbons in her hair to show that, despite her own religious faith, she did not favor the Protestants over the Catholics. Yet, her so-called impartial attitude implied a support of the Union and therefore of the British Crown. But to what extent can their description of Galway be considered as imperialist? To answer this question, their references to Galway as an exotic town will first be examined. Before focusing on the author's desire to highlight their objectivity, finally, the originality of their work as a dialogue between text and image designed to entertain the reader will be analyzed. The tourist's desire to see new landscapes, meet unknown people, and witness unusual practices fuels exoticism, originally referring to a foreign plant. The exotic, the foreign, increasingly gained the connotations of a stimulating or exciting difference, something with which the domestic could be safely spiced. The key concept here is the introduction of the exotic from abroad into a domestic economy. From the earliest days of European voyages, exotic minerals, artifacts, plants, and animals were brought back so that they could titillate the European public imagination. The theme of exoticism inspired many British citizens. Indeed, their imagination could be stimulated as they traveled in Ireland, as they traveled in Ireland, which was part of the Union, but beyond the Irish Sea, so that it was both domestic and foreign. This duality is echoed by the literary style of the Halls, reflecting their excitement, for instance, when they describe Galway, and in particular Galway Bay, with a long enumeration underlining that the wonders themselves were innumerable. I quote, "The whole of the coast round the beautiful bay, although less magnificently rugged than that more to the north, abound in picturesque objects. And the peasantry here, as well as in the less familiar districts, are rich in original character. Their vicinity to the wild Atlantic and their living remote from frequent intercourse with more civilized parts, having preserved much of their primitive simplicity." Here, the theme of exoticism is introduced by expressions such as less familiar, original character. Galwegians definitely embody otherness here. The mention of the peasantry living in a remote area and gifted with a character which was unspoiled by exchanges with the more civilized parts, so-called more civilized parts, clearly connote the author's imperial perspective and their assertion of British hegemony, symbolizing civilization, by contrast with the primitive and therefore exotic inhabitants described in staggering landscapes where they are surrounded by endemic species such as the Cono pig. Its textual and visual portrait was likely to arouse the curiosity of any Victorian, thus lure to Ireland and its intriguing animals. And I'm sure you're going to like the Connacht pig that you can see here. In the footnote, the Connacht pig is even compared to its master, the horse, claiming that, I quote, "A Connacht pig driver is as lean, as ungainly, as clever, and almost as obstinate as his baits." Here, the Victorians' tendency to oppose the Celts, often said to be obstinate, to the Saxons, purported to have different origins, probably inspired their comparison and their emphasis on the dark features of the Connacht pig, but also the local population, supposed to be of Spanish descent. So we have a clear opposition, clear contrast here. This was how the Halls distanced themselves from Galwegians and behaved as ethnographers, representing the Irish peasant as a subjugated other, who is the object of their very text, but also of British domination. It is true that the Halls both belonged to the middle class, contrary to most the people they describe, and who all seem to embody the working class and a different culture, so that there are dynamics of domination and subordination at stake, especially when they report old-fashioned customs found in the Claddagh. I quote, "This singular community are still governed by a king. At one time, this king was absolute, but his power has yielded, like all despotic powers, to the times, and now he is, as one of his subjects informed us, nothing more than the Lord Mayor of Dublin. He has still, however, much influence and sacrifices himself for the good of the people. He is constantly occupied hearing and deciding causes and quarrels, for his people never appeal to a higher tribunal." Exoticism is triggered here by the adjective singular, and the Halls put forward a feudal system here. The absolute king possesses despotic powers and a right to do justice, hence the underlying comment on a backward organization of society, predating civilization and in need of improvement brought by more civilized travelers like the Halls. This is a typically colonial stance of anti-conquest, an expression used by Pratt, as a series of strategies, I quote, "A series of strategies of representation by the European bourgeois subjects who seek to secure their innocence in the same moment as they assert European hegemony." Besides claiming that this monarch was, I quote, "nothing more than the Lord Mayor of Dublin," evacuates the dangers of treason. Galwegians had actually participated in rebellions against England, first by welcoming the survivors of the Spanish Armada in 1588, and then by supporting the Jacobites after the deposition of James II in 1689. And also, when Scotland rebelled too in the mid-18th century, the Catholics were ordered to leave Galway. So there was always this idea that potential treason is at stake, treason to the British Crown. So in spite of their will to put forward the debatable so-called peaceful state of Ireland in their own time, the Halls were aware of these conflicts as they had read references and sometimes expressing some critical distance from them, especially regarding Hardiman's explanation of the execution supposed to have named the Dead Man's Lane downtown. The Halls give a veneer of academic objectivity. Like many 19th century travel writers, they were committed to historical depth, to quote Wasserman, who also explains that cultural works such as their writings were, I quote, "felt to be a necessary complement to economic and political development." So there is a relationship between cultural work and economic and political development. And In the region of Galway, what is interesting is that economic development had actually been seriously altered in the context of Cromwell's reconquest of Ireland between 1649 and 1652. The persecution of Catholics, which lasted until the next century with the penal laws between 1695 and 1728, as well as the Popery Act in 1704, thwarted many exchanges and links with France, Spain, and Scotland, which has previously been the basis of Galway's trade. And this is actually acknowledged by the writers. I quote, Galway was a famous trading port which supplied nearly all Ireland with wine. Although this exclusive trade has of late years greatly diminished, it is still carried on. In 1614, Sir Oliver St. John writes of Galway, the merchants are rich. Previously, Sir Henry Sidney had described them as refined, and old Alien calls it a noted empire of so great fame that an outlandish merchant demanded in what part of Galway Ireland stood. Its fame was credited to the tribes of Galway who were of Anglo-Norman descent, and although they in time became more Irish than the Irish, they were at continual war with the ancient families of the district. Several curious rules prohibiting all intercourse with the natives are yet preserved. The following singular inscription was over the west gate, from the ferocious O'Flaherty's, good Lord, deliver us. So the conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries between native Irish and Anglo-Norman families are highlighted with a reminder of the fear that colonizers sent by Henry VIII threatened to become more Irish than the Irish. But this allusion to a distant form of cultural colonization does not clarify the economic impact that political measures from the center had on a periphery like Galway in the 19th century, the very 19th century. There is no mention of the tensions between Catholics and Protestants, which is consistent with the Ho's desire to please readers of both religious faith, who might be likely to help developing the local economy. The Hos regularly hint at the country's potential, and Galway is noted for its sport. I quote, to open this populous district would be to make it prosperous, excepting the limited lines from Dublin to Kingston, about 6 miles, from Belfast to Lisburn, about the same distance, and from Dublin to Drogheda, about 22 miles. There are no railroads in Ireland. A project is now in course of formation for carrying a line of road from Dublin to Galway. We have made some inquiries on the subject and received some information from P.V. O'Malley, Esquire, civil engineer. He suggests that Wheatstone's electric telegraph should be used. Certainly, if such a project can be carried out, and assuredly it may be, if government will cooperate with some wealthy and enterprising individuals, in no part of the kingdom can the experiment be tried with sure prospect of success. Sticking to their scientific method of investigation, the Hos offer some information presented as reliable and coming from an engineer working on the project. There is a direct call to investors who could finance the construction of the railroad and telegraph, and who are here encouraged with a reassuring prospect of success. It was only in 1895, however, that the first train left Galway, but here the Hos encode what is, I quote, available for improvement. And according to Pratt, this is typical of travelers in the British Empire. Pratt even speaks of a bourgeois humanitarianism characterizing travelers who spoke of advancements across the empire. And this is what we have here. So even when they aim at an objective description of facts, there is a sense of imperialism in their tone. Similarly, their will to document on the natural resources likely to be turned into sources of wealth fits in this perspective. Their description of Galway actually ends on such a note, I quote, We cannot leave the town of Galway without directing the reader's attention to the marble manufactured there, and which so plentifully abounds throughout the county. The subject of Irish marbles is indeed one of vast importance. We shall not, therefore, apologize for treating it at some length. It may be made, under judicious management, a source of immense wealth to the island and employment to its people. The potential employment that could be offered in the extraction of marbles confers a certain moral dimension to the paragraph. In the Victorian mindset, idleness was perceived as a great evil, one of the 7 deadly sins, and the religious undertones would have been perfectly understood by readers. Thus, to struggle against such a waste of marbles and job opportunities, the excerpt just quoted is followed by a 4-page description of the different types of Irish limestones with many details highlighting their ornamental value, sometimes very closely, I quote, resembling that of Paris or Carrara. The comparison with Greek and Italian marbles, as well as the lexical field of riches that you have underlined here, abounds, vast, immense wealth. This lexical field puts forward the value of this resource, and another apostrophe to the reader's attention starts a form of extra-diegetic conversation between the authors and the reader on the topic. Hazel Morris, who studied various writings by the Halls, believes that such technical and historical accounts were most likely written by Samuel Carter, whereas the narratives were most probably written by Anna Maria. So there are indeed 2 anecdotes unfolded by the authors in the pages devoted to Galway. The first is that of the son of James Lynch Fitzstephen, the mayor of the town in 1493, who had reportedly murdered a Spaniard with whom his father was in trade. The sad end of the legend is known to many Galwegians to this day. The murderer was hanged by order of his own father, as detailed in an extensive footnote. On the contrary, the second anecdote is in the main text and occupies 2 pages, introduced with these words, setting the romantic atmosphere of a wild scenery inhabited by mysterious figures. Wandering one day by the shore of the broad ocean, an incident occurred to us, the recital of which may not be unpleasing to our readers. We had walked a long way when in the distance we saw above the level of the sea what at first sight we imagined to be, so perfectly motionless was it, an artificial figure. The figurehead of a ship, perhaps, placed there as a beacon. But the wind blowing strongly from the land, we perceived some drapery in motion, which led to think that it was really a human being. Still, there was no stir or indication of life or any interest manifested in surrounding objects. So the wandering of the authors and their glimpse of a lonely silhouette on a deserted and windy shore may remind us of Gaspar Friedrich's Wanderer above the sea of fog. To this romantic atmosphere is added a touch of the Gothic genre with the hesitation regarding the nature of the silhouette. Not certainly human, given its lack of movement, and wrapped in some drapery like a ghost. So the mastery of the Gothic and romantic characteristics expressed in these lines revealed the literary qualities of the writers, who then became characters within their own story as they started to speak to this enigmatic Irish woman. In the ensuing dialogue, the homodiegetic narrator gradually finds out that the woman is waiting for her husband's return from the sea. However, the intervention of 2 of her relatives allows to understand that the sailor drowned 6 years earlier and that his widow never accepted it. Her textual portrait emphasizes her heart-rendering condition. I quote, "It is quite impossible to fancy a greater picture of patient, meaningless endurance than this poor woman. She was evidently a living sorrow. The expression of her face was that of intense anxiety." The vocabulary of feelings which is used here indicates that this story must have been written by Anna Maria rather than Samuel Carter. Pratt found that women writing travelogues were likely to adopt a sentimental perspective, and Susan Bassnett observed that their style was frequently based on fictionalizing processes which were influenced by literary movements and which often resorted to dialogues. Bassnett added that they were regularly attentive to poverty. And actually, these 5 characteristics are found here with the construction of a sentimental narrative, including direct speech between the narrator and a distressed woman presented as a Gothic apparition, so that we do have the Gothic here. So this would confirm the hypothesis that such literary passages were by the hand of Anna Maria. Besides, the very telling of the story is justified at the beginning with the expression, I quote, "The recital of this incident may not be unpleasing to our readers." So we have the double negation, may not be unpleasing to our readers. It suggests a writer who is trying to give a legitimacy to her voice, a common point to many female travelers, according to Bassnett, who explains that they tended to be less authoritative than their male counterparts, and also that they needed to define their literary identity. Additionally, there is an asserted intention to please readers here, which implies some preoccupation regarding the future reception of the text. To enhance the pleasure of the reader, the Widow's Tale is illustrated with a black and white engraving that you can see here, also resorting to the Gothic, with a full view of a mysterious figure standing bare feet on a rugged shore, with her black hair and dark shawl blown by the wind, a reminder of the hostility of natural forces. All these details give a Gothic dimension to the view, which is also gifted with a sense of what the Victorians called picturesque. That is to say, panoramic viewpoints fit for dramatic effect and stimulating for the mind, to the point that they would be proper subjects for paintings, and therefore proper subjects for picturesque hunters who are traveling in search of inspiration for their art. The Halls were also trying to attract them to Galway, to attract artists to Galway, an area, I quote, "full of the very singular and picturesque remains of antiquity, just like of antiquity." So this is direct appeal to artists. And another mention is very interesting. Later on, we have almost every peasant girl might serve as a model for the sculpture. So they are really trying to attract as many tourists as possible. They also speak directly to future retirees, students of heraldry, and generally all the tourists interested in antiquity, whose curiosity might also have been aroused by the history of the Claddagh wedding ring, told and illustrated on page 458. Indeed, the picturesque was intimately related with antiquity or objects and sites gifted with historical significance. This is visualized in all the illustrations. There are 11 in total, and apart from those of the seaman's wife, Claddagh ring, and Conopy that we have already seen, each image illustrates a quaint architectural curiosity, such as Tuam Cathedral, offering a typically picturesque view, complete with an opening of the perspective, some elements of wild nature in the foreground, among which, and in the middle ground, can be seen the small silhouette of a shepherd leading 2 cows, and of course in the background, we can see the ancient building. So there are also 3 examples of arched gateways, highlighting Galway's architectural parallels with Spain. There's also the mayor's house, which is illustrated, where the execution of James Lynch Fitzstephen had supposedly taken place. But also, we can also see Buttermilk Lane, I quote, an ancient gateway through which is seen the aged, venerable, and most interesting church, full of the very singular and picturesque remains of antiquity. So we always have this idea of antiquity, historical interest. In addition, we have two illustrations called The Fish Market and A Cabin Door Cladder, both vignettes comprising female figures who seem to belong to the Middle Ages given their attire, as you can see here. Such vignettes enhance the visual pleasure of readers, and the halls were well aware of the importance of illustrations. Samuel Carter claimed in the 1840s that some of their volumes, such as the Book of British Ballads, were, I quote, more important for the illustrations than for the text. The artistic dialogue created between two different semiotic systems corresponds here to an example of interpicturality, a term used by Liliane Louvel, given that the image is included inside the text, inviting the reader to pause and contemplate the drawing. Moreover, most engravings reproduce a real artwork so that it doubles the reality effect of the text. Both text and image invite the reader to witness the picturesque beauty of Galway's area. The visual and textual description of the region form an iconotext as they work together to stimulate the reader's mental representations of the place, as well as their desire to see the town for themselves. In addition, the engravings are directly commented upon in the text, which is an example of metapicturality. Both authors actually considering that their work was a collaboration with artists. And I quote from the pages devoted to Galway. The examples we give were selected almost at random by Mr. Evans of Eton, to whom we are indebted for the majority of the illustrations which ornament this portion of our work. We are fortunate in having obtained the cooperation of so accomplished an artist, and lament that the beauty of his colored drawings cannot be satisfactorily transferred to our pages by the aid of wood engraving. William Evans of Eton, who was born in 1798 and died in 1877, was a British artist who had toured Conamara in 1838, as witnessed by his watercolors preserved at the National Gallery of Ireland. His artworks were indeed made colorful by the inclusion of bright red skirts and shawls of Irish women, as in Buttermilk Lane, Galway. This may account for the regret expressed by the halls regarding the absence of such pleasant colors in their own volumes. Now, the original watercolor is not exactly the same as the engraving reproduced in their pages. A dog has been added here in the center, replacing a character. And the placement of character has been slightly modified here and there, and also under the arch there and there. You can see it's not the exact same number of characters. Now, these modifications hint at the transforming process which was necessary to turn a work of art into an engraving. An etcher first needed to draw and carve the drawing onto wood, which in this case was done by an engraver called Whymper. His signature appears here in the lower right-hand corner. Yet, the impression conveyed by the engraving and what could possibly be its original version is the same. These images put forward the exotic dimension of Galway, presented as a quaint little port marked by a singular architecture resulting from its exchanges with Spain and inhabited by charming Galwegians whose lifestyle reminded of times gone by and thus offered a complete change to travelers. The artist, William Evans, was a traveler himself, just like Anna Maria and Samuel Carter Hall, so that their cultural productions reflect the the perspectives of outsiders who were in search of beauty for the painter and reasons to attract British tourists for the writers. The result is that the pages devoted to Galway visually and textually highlight the desirable difference of this place based on its unique people and scenery, but also on a certain sense of impending loss. Galway's monuments are actually qualified as, I quote, records of all times which are rapidly falling into ruin, and its, I quote, melancholy vestiges of fallen greatness must rapidly pass away. So the reader is warned of the emergency of visiting the town, especially because of the repetition of the adverb rapidly here. Hence the originality of this travelogue. It constantly creates an impression of drama by insisting on the destruction and ruins, decay and disappearance, or extinction and death. This may also account for the map of Galway, inserted as a frontispiece to the chapter devoted to the area. It reports the name of every town, lake, or region, such as Joyce's country, you can see there, a hilly area named after Thomas Joyce, a Welshman who had emigrated there in the 14th century. Consequently, their volumes are also presented as an effort to preserve for future times a description of what Galway and its area were like during their visits between the 1820s and the 1840s. Given that the volumes continue to be read to this day and to inspire historians, this objective seems to have been fulfilled. Yet the inclusion of the map here reminds today's reader of the colonial reflex of mapping the territory before land settlement and subdivision into lots to be given to new owners before implementation of a foreign administration. So, in spite of their foreign origin, the Halls wrote with an imperialist bias as they offered maps, recommendations to investors, and information on the natural resources available. This is also seen in their description of the noble but backward peasantry who embodied otherness. Just like their customs, their jewelry, or the species found in their farms, just as the Kono pig. But to be fair to their work, it should also be noted that they adopted a work methodology reflecting their quest for objectivity by referencing different historical sources on the history of Galway, by expressing critical distance, and leading investigations with interviews. This allowed them to present themselves as reliable writers, and by doing so, they asserted their innocence or lack of political prejudice. But according to Pratt, this was a common attitude to travel writers who described their experience throughout the British Empire. Even if they do not use the vocabulary of conquest and power because of their apparent innocence, the main protagonists of the AntiConquest, and I am going to quote from Pratt, has, I quote, a European landscape discourse, end of quote, and I quote, his imperial eyes passively look out and possess. Nonetheless, as Anna Maria and Samuel Carter Hall looked out at Galway and transformed their vision into their travelogue, they held a conversation between text and image, which has given birth to an original work. The literary qualities of the text, resorting to the Gothic or the picturesque, are echoed by the vignettes, which enhance the pleasure of the reader. These romantic or Gothic images surrounded by the textual descriptions are more than mere illustrations. They add a valuable artistic dimension to the volumes, given that the Halls worked with talented artists who could, just like their own writing, convey a sense of drama to the reader. And Victorian readers doubtlessly appreciated this conversation between the visual and verbal forms of expression. Even if the Quarterly Review complained that there were too many, I quote, luxuriant lakes and sparkling billows in the prose by the Halls, the Times appreciated, I quote, the desire to exhibit things as they really are, end of quote. Just like the Morning Chronicle enjoyed, I quote, the truthfulness of the two editors, end of quote. Encouraged by their success, the Halls then wrote similar volumes, such as Handbooks for Ireland in 1853, or A Companion to Killarney in 1878, while their 3 books of islanded scenery character went into several editions. Those of 1841, 1843 were followed by many others, as in 1846, 1860, or 1873. And more recently, a reworked and shortened version was edited by Michael Scott in 1984, which shows that, despite their imperialist perspective, the Hall's account of their own visits to Ireland continues to fascinate readers and thus can be seen as a valuable literary artwork to this day.
Thank you, Amélie, for that wonderful talk. We were thrilled to have your company with us in Galway and to learn so much more about the Halls. Thank you very, very much.